I thought the biggest problem with my new job would be the boredom. After all, who goes to a pharmacy 3 in the morning? When I took the night shift at Briarwood 24-hour, I just wanted something stable. A job that would pay my bills and give me time to figure out what to do with my life. I wasn't expecting luxury. The ad promised a quiet environment and flexibility. What it didn't mention was just how strange quiet could be. The pharmacy was on a nearly deserted road, with just a gas station and a pawn shop nearby. During the day, it was like any other pharmacy. But at night, it felt like a place that existed outside of time, as if the rest of the world was just a distant memory. When I showed up for my first shift, Mr. Harlan was waiting for me. He was a thin man with deep-set eyes and a way of speaking that made everything sound like an order, even a simple "good evening." He took me inside and started the tour. "Here's the counter. Don't worry about the prescriptions. It's always quiet at night." He gestured toward the shelves, arranged almost obsessively. "Make sure everything stays like this. Organization is important." I nodded, trying to look interested. "The bathroom is over there. It's not used often. And here's the stockroom." He opened a door in the back, revealing a narrow, dark hallway. "Never leave this door open for too long. It might attract." "Problems? Problems?" I asked, laughing. He didn't answer. He just kept going with the tour like I hadn't said anything. When we finished, he handed me a sheet of paper. It was a list of rules. "Always check the mirrors before AM after that. Don't stare at them for too long. Ignore any customer who doesn't come through the front door. If you hear knocking on the back door, turn on the radio and turn up the volume. At 4:20 a.m., check that the lights in Corridor 7 are off. If they aren't, turn them off immediately." I looked at him, waiting for an explanation. He just said, "You just need to follow the rules." "It's simple." I laughed, thinking it was some local tradition or an inside joke. He didn't laugh back. "You'll understand," was all he said before leaving me alone. The first shift was quiet. There was something reassuring about being surrounded by medicine and hygiene products, all organized in perfect rows. The broken jukebox in the corner was a relic from another time, gathering dust next to an old soda machine that seemed never to be used. Around AM, the first customer of the night came in. He was a man in a suit, even with the suffocating Texas heat. He seemed out of place, like he'd stepped out of an old movie and stumbled into my reality. "I need something for a headache," he said, his voice low and raspy. I pointed him to the right aisle and waited for him to come back with the product, but he stood still. "Can you show me?" he asked. With a sigh, I went to the aisle with him. When I picked up a box of painkillers and turned around, he was gone. The pharmacy was completely empty. I went back to the counter, confused, and saw that the metal detector at the entrance hadn't gone off when he came in. That night, I broke my first rule. Not by choice, but out of ignorance. Just before AM, I went to the bathroom. The light was dim, flickering occasionally, and the mirror above the sink had a stain that was hard to ignore. While washing my hands, I looked up and saw my reflection. But something was wrong. The reflection blinked, but I didn't blink. I rushed out of the bathroom, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the flickering light was messing with my perception. But deep down, something told me that wasn't normal. When my shift ended, the sun was already starting to rise. Mr. Harlan showed up to replace me, but didn't say anything about my tired appearance or the missing customer. He just nodded and started organizing the medicines on the counter. Before I left, I asked about the rules. "Are they really necessary?" He stopped what he was doing and looked directly at me. "If you want to last here, yes." And with that, I went home, knowing that the next night would be even stranger. On the second night, I went to work with an uncomfortable feeling. The idea of the rules kept hammering in my head, and the memory of the man in the suit and the reflection in the mirror wouldn't let me rest. I arrived 15 minutes early. Mr. Harlan was already there, arranging a shelf of vitamins like his life depended on it. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond immediately. He just finished aligning the bottles, one by one, then turned to me. "Remember the rules." "I know," I replied, a little more defensively than I meant. "Are you sure?" He gave me a sharp look, as if he could see my hesitation. "One thing about this place, it doesn't tolerate the curious. Just follow the rules. Nothing more, nothing less." Harlan left shortly after, and the pharmacy went quiet again. A heavy silence that seemed to stretch down the aisles like a living presence. This time, I decided to take the rules more seriously. At a.m., I checked the mirrors, glancing over each one quickly. Everything seemed normal. My reflections were in place, acting as they should. I breathed a sigh of relief. Around 3:30, I was at the counter reviewing stock when I heard a sound from the children's medicine aisle. A noise, like something falling to the floor. "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no answer. I grabbed a flashlight, more out of impulse than necessity, and walked down the aisle. A package of diapers was on the floor. Strange, since I was sure no one had come in since my shift started. When I bent down to pick up the package, I heard a low sound behind me. A breath. I spun around suddenly, but the aisle was empty. Just the shelves, the air conditioning humming quietly, and the unmistakable smell of cleaning products. I hurried back to the counter faster than I'd like to admit. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was just my imagination. Still, I kept the radio on for the rest of the night. At 4:15, I reached the rule for Corridor 7. I grabbed the flashlight again, even though the pharmacy's lights were working perfectly, and walked to the end of the aisle. The lights were off. My hand froze on the switch. For some reason, I hesitated before turning them on. That's when I noticed something that chilled my blood. The reflection of the shelves in the window glass was wrong. They were misaligned, even though they looked perfectly straight in my direct line of sight. And there was a shadow. A dark figure motionless at the end of the aisle. "Who's there?" My voice came out louder than I intended. The figure didn't respond. I stood still for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Turning on the lights seemed like the logical thing, but something deep in my mind screamed at me not to. I broke the rule. "Forget it," I muttered, and walked toward the shadow. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a person. It was something. Its form seemed to flicker, as if it were made of solid smoke. And then, without warning, it moved. A searing pain exploded in my head, like someone had driven invisible claws into my brain. I staggered back, and when I looked again, the shadow was gone. Corridor 7 was empty, and the lights finally came on, briefly flickering before stabilizing. I returned to the counter, trembling. I looked at the clock for 19. At exactly 20, Mr. Harlan called. "You broke the rule, didn't you?" His voice was deeper than usual. I don't know what I saw," I stammered. "It doesn't matter what you saw," he said. "What matters is that now you're marked. Be careful." Tonight was just a warning. He hung up before I could respond. On the third night, I was already on the verge of quitting. Whatever was happening in that place was more than I could handle, but there was one thing keeping me there. I needed the money. It wasn't just about overdue bills. It was my pride. If I left now, I'd be that guy who quits when things get tough. I arrived for my shift at 10:45 p.m., but Mr. Harlan wasn't there to greet me. The pharmacy was empty, the lights all on, as if someone had left in a hurry. Strange, since he was always punctual and meticulous. "Mr. Harlan?" I called, my voice echoing. No answer. After checking the back and finding nothing, I sat at the counter. It was 11:30 p.m. when I heard the doorbell ring. I looked up, expecting to see a normal customer, maybe someone looking for insomnia medicine. Instead, 2 children walked in. They couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, dressed in clothes that looked like they came from an old thrift store. The girl had tight braids and was holding the boy's hand, who carried a worn-out teddy bear. "Are you lost?" I asked, stepping out from behind the counter. "No," the girl replied. Her voice was surprisingly firm. "We're waiting for someone." "Waiting for who?" She just shrugged, as if it didn't matter. There was something about the way she spoke that unsettled me. It wasn't the tone or the words themselves, but the feeling that she knew more than she should. "Look, kids, it's not safe to be here at this hour," I continued, trying to sound authoritative. "Do you want me to call someone? Your parents, maybe?" The boy, who had been silent until then, looked up at me. His eyes were dark, with no reflection of light. "You shouldn't have broken the rule," he said. My feet felt glued to the floor. It was like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. "How? How do you know about that?" The girl pressed the boy's teddy bear against his chest. "He knows everything." "Who?" My voice came out as a hoarse whisper. Before she could answer, the radio on the counter started crackling. There was no music, just static. The children turned and walked out the door, but the alarm that should have gone off when someone entered or left stayed silent. I went to the entrance, but they were already gone. Outside, the road was empty. No lights except for those of the pharmacy and the gas station down the way. When I returned to the counter, the radio was still crackling. I turned it off, but the sound didn't stop. It kept echoing through the place, coming from all directions. I called Mr. Harlan, but the phone just rang until it went to voicemail. The rest of the night passed in a state of nervous vigilance. Every sound, the hum of the air conditioner, the creak of a shelf seemed amplified. Around a.m., I heard the doorbell again. A man walked in. He was wearing a delivery uniform with a cap that hid most of his face. He seemed normal at first, until I noticed his shoes. They were covered in mud. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Delivery," he said, lifting a box. There was no label, and the box looked old. "I didn't order anything. It's for you," he insisted. Reluctantly, I accepted the box. It was surprisingly light, as if it were empty. The delivery man turned and left without saying another word. I placed the box on the counter, eyeing it with suspicion. Something about it seemed off, as if it didn't belong to the real world. Finally, I opened it. Inside was a single item, an old pocket watch, its glass cracked, the hands frozen at 4:20. The message was clear. After the delivery the night before, any illusion that this was just paranoia or coincidence was shattered. Something truly strange was happening in that pharmacy. I arrived for my shift with a mix of fatigue and irritation. I didn't see Mr. Harlan, but this time he had left a note on the counter. No matter what happens, don't look at the clock. Of course, I thought, because that makes perfect sense. I crumpled the note and threw it in the trash. The night started off quiet as usual. Around a.m., I took my regular walk through the aisles. The shelves were in order, the stock intact. I checked the mirrors at AM, and this time I didn't see anything unusual. My reflection was exactly where it should be. But at 3:15, the power flickered. It didn't completely go out, but it was enough to put me on alert. When the light stabilized, I noticed something in corridor 4. A faint rustling, as if something had moved too quickly for me to see. "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed, but the sound seemed to be absorbed by the walls. I grabbed the flashlight and went to investigate. As I got closer, I noticed a strange smell, something between rusty iron and wet earth. The air felt heavier, as if the oxygen had been drained. That's when I heard it. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of one. All the usual noises, the hum of the air conditioner, the slight creak of the building disappeared. And then a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I turned so fast I almost dropped the flashlight. There was no one there. Just the shelves, aligned in endless rows, seeming taller than before. The whisper came again, this time from another aisle. "Why did you break the rule?" "Who's speaking?" I shouted. My heart was racing, but my voice sounded more irritated than scared. "Show yourself." Nothing. I returned to the counter, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. There were no cameras in the place, at least none that I had seen, but the sensation was as if there were hundreds of eyes staring at me, analyzing my every move. At 3:45, I started hearing footsteps. Slow, rhythmic, echoing through the aisles. They weren't constant. They stopped and started at irregular intervals, as if whoever it was were playing with me. The radio crackled again, and a voice emerged from the static. "Clock." I refused to look at it. I fought the impulse to turn my head, even though I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I grabbed the crumpled note from the trash and read it again. "No matter what happens, don't look at the clock." The lights flickered again, and the footsteps grew louder, closer. I grabbed my phone and called Mr. Harlan, but as usual, it went straight to voicemail. "I need answers," I blurted, almost shouting into the message. "If you don't tell me what's going on, I'm leaving. And I'm never coming back." As soon as I hung up, the power went out completely. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the radio was making noise now. The flashlight was my only source of light, and its beam seemed weaker than it should have been. I walked past the counter, illuminating the nearest aisle, but I didn't see anything. That's when I felt it. Something passed by my side, fast as a cold wind, leaving me completely paralyzed. It wasn't just the cold. It was the presence. An invisible weight that crushed me, making me want to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. The sensation lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When I finally regained control, the lights flickered back on, blinking before stabilizing. I looked at the clock on the wall. 4:20. And then it started spinning. The hands moved on their own, too quickly to follow any logic. First forward, then backward, until they finally stopped, exactly where they had been before. I wanted to run, to leave that place, and never come back. But something kept me there. A mix of morbid curiosity and something else. I grabbed the note again and tucked it in my pocket. I had broken the rules before, but now I knew. Whatever was in that place, it was playing with me. And it had no intention of stopping anytime soon. When the clock struck 4:20 and stopped spinning, I felt something change. It wasn't just the brief relief that the moment had ended. It was the sense that a new phase had begun. Like a storm slowly approaching, and you know there's nowhere to run. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me out of my stupor. When I saw the name on the screen, a chill ran down my spine. "Harlan." I answered without hesitation. Finally, I said, anger and relief mixed in my voice. Do you have any idea what's going on here? There's been a problem, hasn't there? His voice was deeper than usual, drawn out, almost tired. Problem? Is this a joke? I shifted nervously, pacing from one foot to the other. What was that with the clock? And the kids? And the delivery guy? What's happening in this place? Harlan sighed heavily on the other end of the line. I told you to follow the rules. And what does that mean? How does any of this make sense? Should I be worried about monsters coming out of the stockroom or ghosts in the mirror? For a moment, there was silence. Then he responded, but his words only confused me more. Not everything strange is supernatural, kid. But some things are too old for you to understand. Just follow the rules, and you'll be fine. Old, I repeated, as if the word were the key to a riddle. There are things that shouldn't be here, but they are. He continued, ignoring my question. They get trapped between one place and another, and the pharmacy is a crossing point. But they just want attention. If you ignore them, they'll ignore you too. That made my blood run cold. You're saying this pharmacy is a door to another world? Not exactly, he replied, an impatient tone in his voice. But that doesn't really matter. What matters is that you follow the rules. Got it? And if I don't, I asked more defiantly than I meant to. What do you think is going to happen? He paused, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. The pharmacy will collect its price. The call dropped. I looked at the phone screen, waiting for him to call back, but nothing. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. That's when I realized I was completely alone. I looked at the pocket watch still sitting on the counter. It seemed harmless now, just a broken object, but every time I stared at it, I felt like I was being watched. I went back to work, or at least tried to. I organized shelves, cleaned the counter, but nothing felt natural. It was as if every movement was calculated, as if something was waiting for me to drop my guard. At exactly 5 o'clock, the doorbell rang. A woman entered, with long, tangled hair, dressed in white. She looked lost, but there was something strange about her. Not just her appearance, but the way she moved as if she were gliding, not walking. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice firm despite the lump in my throat. She didn't answer. She just walked toward corridor 2. "Ma'am, we're almost closed," I insisted, following her. When I turned the corner, she was gone. The corridor was empty, but the air felt colder. And then I saw it. An entire shelf was empty. Medications, bottles, all gone. I went to the system to check the cameras, but as usual, the recording was blurry. All I could see were smudges of movement, as if something was moving too fast to be captured. At that moment, I knew I had to make a choice. Either leave and never come back, or stay and find out what was really going on. When the clock on the wall struck 6 o'clock, the sky began to lighten. The clock finally hit 6 o'clock, and with it, the beginning of dawn. The sunlight should have been a relief, a sign that the night was over, but the feeling of unease remained. In fact, it felt like it had settled into me, like a second skin. I finished my shift mechanically, making sure everything was in order. Doors locked, aisles clean, stock checked. But each task was accompanied by the feeling that something was watching me, just waiting for me to drop my guard. When I stepped out the front door, the weak light of dawn painted the street in pastel shades. It was almost beautiful, but it felt out of place after everything that had happened that night. My car was parked on the other side of the small parking lot, and the walk to it felt like an eternity. As I drove home, I noticed something strange. The car's radio, which usually stayed on some random station, was crackling incessantly. I changed frequencies, but the static remained the same. I turned the device off and drove in silence. That morning, even at home, I couldn't sleep. Every noise in the apartment seemed amplified, as if something invisible was there with me. Even the sound of the wind blowing against the windows had a sharper tone, almost like a lament. When I returned to the pharmacy that night, Mr. Harlan was already there, smoking a cigarette outside. He looked more worn out than usual, his eyes sunken as if he hadn't slept in days. "Did you see anything?" he asked without any preamble. "I saw a lot," I replied, crossing my arms. "But nothing that makes sense." Harlan took a long drag from his cigarette before stamping it out against the concrete. "You'll get used to it." "Everyone does." "You mean the others who worked here before me. Where are they now?" He didn't answer. He just shook his head, as if my question didn't deserve a response. Inside the pharmacy, the atmosphere felt different. The lights flickered more frequently, and the aisles seemed narrower. And there was something in the air, an almost palpable tension. At 2:30 a.m., the doorbell rang. It was a tall man, wearing a heavy coat and a cap, despite the heat. He didn't say anything when he entered. He just walked slowly up to the counter. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He didn't respond. He simply placed a list of medications on the counter. When I picked up the paper, I felt a shiver. The list was handwritten, but the handwriting looked old, as if it had been written with a quill and ink. "Can you wait a moment?" I asked, trying to buy some time. The man didn't move. He just stared at me with a vacant look, his eyes hidden under the brim of his cap. I went to the stockroom, more to get away from him than to actually retrieve anything. Inside, the silence was absolute, and the feeling of being watched was unbearable. When I came back, the man was gone. "Sir?" I called, looking around. He wasn't in any of the aisles, and the front door was still locked. I took the paper he had left and tucked it in my pocket. Later that night, as I was reviewing the stock, I realized the medications from the list were missing. It was as if he had gotten what he wanted without even taking them. At 4:00 a.m., the radio started crackling again. This time, the voice wasn't Harlan's, but it sounded like a mix of several different voices speaking at once. "It's coming." What was coming? Before I could process it, the sound was abruptly cut off, and the pharmacy's lights flickered, brighter than ever. I looked at the clock. It was still 4:00, but the hands were frozen, as if time had stopped. I felt that presence again, the same oppressive weight I had felt the night before. But this time, it felt closer, almost tangible. I grabbed my phone and tried to call Harlan, but the call dropped. There was no signal, which was impossible in this area. I went back to the counter and saw something that made me freeze. The crumpled note, the one I had thrown away and then put back in my pocket, was stretched out on the counter, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. This time, there was a new message written on it. "The light no longer protects." My heart raced, and as much as I wanted to run, something kept me there. It wasn't courage. It was fear. A fear that paralyzed me, but also kept me from giving up. The clock started moving again, but it didn't ease the tension. On the contrary, after the message on the note, I couldn't tear myself away from the counter. The phrase echoed in my mind like a dark warning. The light no longer protects. Harlan was missing. I tried calling him more than once, but it was as if the line were dead. Even the pharmacy radio, which always crackled with distorted voices or old news, was silent now. At 4:20, the doorbell rang again, but no one entered. The ringing continued. Ding, ding, ding. Each chime sounded louder, more insistent. I walked up to the door and looked outside, but the parking lot was empty. No cars, no sign of life. Is anyone there? My voice came out shaky, breaking the silence. Nothing. When I returned to the counter, I noticed something that hadn't been there before, a bottle of syrup. It was old, with a faded label, the kind of thing you don't see in modern pharmacies anymore. I picked up the bottle, trying to read the smudged words on the label. I could only make out one: purification. A sound from the stockroom made me drop the bottle. It was a sharp crack, like wood breaking, followed by a dragged, heavy sound. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to run out, but something was pulling me toward the stockroom, as if it were something I needed to see. When I reached the door, I felt the air change. It was colder, almost freezing, and the smell of something chemical, like alcohol and mildew, filled my nostrils. Whatever it is, I just want it to end, I muttered to myself. The stockroom was darker than it should have been. The lights flickered, casting dancing shadows on the shelves. It was as if the place were shrinking, molding itself to my fear. That's when I saw it. On the floor, deep down the hall, was something that shouldn't have been there. It was a hole. Not a hole in the concrete floor, but a tear, as if reality had been split. Inside, there was absolute darkness, an emptiness that seemed to pulse slightly. I stepped closer, each step heavy, each breath shorter. When I got close enough, I heard voices. Indistinct whispers, like a crowd speaking at once, but no words made sense. What is that? My voice came out in a trembling whisper, as if speaking louder could trigger something. The hole responded, not with words, but with movement. Something shifted inside it too fast for me to distinguish. It was a shadow, but not like the ones we know. This one seemed alive, aware, observant. I took a step back, but the ground under my feet gave slightly. I looked down and realized the shelves were slowly sinking into the floor, as if the stockroom itself was being pulled into the hole. My instinct screamed at me to run, but before I could move, a hand emerged from the darkness. It was human, or at least it looked that way. Pale, thin, with fingers too long. It grasped the ground, pulling the rest of a body that should never have existed. It was a humanoid figure, but misshapen, as if it had been molded by someone who had never seen a real human. Its eyes were where they should have been, but they were empty holes, and its mouth, though smiling, had no lips, just jagged teeth. It looked at me, and then it spoke, but its voice didn't come from its mouth. It seemed to resonate in my mind, cold and emotionless. You broke the rules. I didn't do anything, I retorted, my voice cracking with fear. It tilted its head, as if studying me. Yet, you're still here. And that has a price. Before I could react, the stockroom began to shake. Shelves were falling one by one, swallowed by the hole. Bottles shattered, medications scattered across the floor, but no sound seemed real. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, as if I'd never reach the door. When I finally reached the counter, the clock read 6 o'clock a.m. The tremor stopped. The hole disappeared. But the figure? It was still there, on the edge of my vision, watching me. The clock read 6:45 a.m. My shift was almost over, and I was counting the minutes until I could leave that place. The dawn was beginning to filter through the pharmacy window, but instead of bringing relief, it only intensified the discomfort. What had happened in the past hours felt like a fever, a nightmare, but I knew it wasn't just that. Something had changed in me. Something was different. I still couldn't understand what had happened to Harlan. I didn't know if he was still somewhere around, or if he had simply disappeared. The messages, the note with the strange phrase, the voices. It all felt absurdly real, but I was fighting the idea that it could be anything more than an episode of stress, perhaps triggered by fear and the pressure of my job. Just a few more minutes, I whispered to myself, feeling the weight of the night still hanging on my shoulders. I always followed the same routine before leaving. I turned off the alarm system, turned off the lights, and locked the doors. But that night felt different. I was restless, almost paralyzed. The clock read 6:50 a.m., and instead of feeling relieved, I felt an increasing anxiety. Something told me to leave, but something else was holding me back, like an invisible force. I turned off the lights and the security system. The automatic door opened, and I stepped outside. The parking lot was empty, as always. No soul in sight. The sound of the wind cutting through the silence of the early morning was the only thing I could hear. And then I heard it. A voice. It came from the back of the pharmacy. It wasn't a familiar voice, but it had a tone that made me stop immediately. "You're not leaving like this." I froze. The voice wasn't anyone I knew, but at the same time, it felt unmistakable, as if it were in my head. I turned slowly, almost unwillingly, and looked inside the pharmacy. Everything was silent. The stockroom, the counter area, the hallway. But for a moment, I had the sense that something or someone was there, watching me. A sense of presence, as if I wasn't alone anymore, even though I knew I should be. It was a subtle feeling, like the walls were closing in around me. It was as if all the time I had spent there had made me part of the place. Something inside me knew I wasn't just passing through anymore, like a simple employee. I was already part of that cycle. I wanted to leave. I should have left, but something was stopping me. I looked at the shelves, and for a moment, I thought I saw the faces of the customers, but they were all empty, like faded figures. That was enough to give me a shock of reality. Maybe I was going crazy. Maybe it was just stress, lack of sleep, the constant pressure of working the night shift in a place like that. Still, the feeling didn't go away. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of there, but my body felt heavy, like it was stuck in place. No matter how hard I tried, something inside me didn't want to leave it behind. It was like I was being pulled back. I felt a cold hand on my neck, as if someone had come up behind me and placed their fingers there. But when I turned quickly, no one was there. The place was empty. I was alone, but the fear lingered. The sound of something banging in the back made me look again. When I looked toward the stockroom, everything seemed normal. The hallway was empty, but I still felt the weight of the gaze on me, as if the pharmacy was watching me, as if the building knew I would never truly be able to leave and move on. I forced myself to take the last step, and this time I didn't look back. But when the door closed behind me, I heard a sound, a low crack, almost imperceptible, as if something had broken. The feeling lingered for days. I woke up that morning with the daylight streaming through the window, and the pharmacy already seemed distant. But on every corner, on every street, I felt that something had changed. The feeling that I would always return there, that I would never truly leave that place behind. I never saw Harlan again. There was never any news of him. And the pharmacy stayed open, as always, with the same flow of customers. But something inside me knew I would never be more than a cog in that place. And maybe one day I'd return. The cycle never ends.